In October 1970, an American F-4 Phantom pilot locked onto an enemy fighter over the Suez Canal and froze. The plane in his sights wasn't flown by an Egyptian. The voice on the radio wasn't speaking Arabic. It was Russian. The Soviet Union had just entered a war it was never supposed to be part of. And for weeks, 3 governments knew the truth and none of them said a word. This isn't a story about heroes. It's a story about 3 governments, Moscow, Jerusalem, and Washington, each playing a dirty game with other people's lives, and the one summer it almost blew up in all of their faces. By 1969, Egypt was desperate. Its air force had been gutted in the Six-Day War 2 years earlier. Hundreds of planes destroyed on the ground before they ever left the runway. In a single morning, Egypt lost roughly a third of its entire air force. President Gamal Abdel Nasser had staked his political survival on standing up to Israel, and instead he'd suffered the most humiliating military defeat in modern Arab history, broadcast to the world in real time. For Egyptian pilots, the war that followed, what history now calls the War of Attrition, was a grinding, one-sided nightmare. Israeli jets ruled the skies over the Suez Canal almost unopposed. Egyptian air bases were struck again and again, sometimes daily. Morale collapsed. Nasser needed a way to keep fighting without an air force capable of doing it. So he turned to Moscow and made a request no Soviet leader had ever agreed to before. The Soviet Union had every reason to say yes. Egypt was a key ally in a region where American influence was growing, and losing it to Israel, and by extension to Washington, was unacceptable. But Moscow couldn't simply hand Egypt more planes. Egyptian pilots were already proving unable to hold the line. What Nasser needed wasn't hardware, it was trained combat pilots, Soviet ones. In January 1970, the Kremlin approved a classified deployment codenamed Operation Kavkaz. Thousands of Soviet personnel, pilots, air defense crews, technicians, began moving into Egypt, transported at night aboard cargo ships and unmarked aircraft, listed on manifest as agricultural equipment and construction workers. It was a deliberate deception, built not for the enemy, but to give Moscow deniability if anyone ever asked what those ships were really carrying. In reality, entire squadrons of Soviet-flown MiG-21s began flying combat air patrols over the Nile Delta, wearing Egyptian markings and using Arabic call signs to disguise who was actually in the cockpit. For the first time since the Korean War, Soviet pilots were flying combat missions against an American-backed military. And this time, it was happening in the open skies of the Middle East, where Israeli and American intelligence were watching every radar return. The deception didn't stop at cargo manifests. It extended to the pilots themselves. Many of the men selected for the mission weren't told their real destination until they were already airborne. Some believed they were flying a routine training exercise to a friendly airbase. They landed instead in the desert heat of Egypt, thousands of miles from home. Once there, they lived under strict isolation. Letters home were censored, no mention of location, no mention of the mission. Sometimes no real mail at all for months. Soviet personnel were kept largely separate from the Egyptian population, and, in a number of documented cases, from Egyptian forces themselves. Friction between the two allied militaries was common, rooted in language barriers, mutual distrust, and Soviet officers who made little secret of their low opinion of Egyptian combat readiness. Officially, none of these men existed. If they died, their own government wouldn't claim them. They had become invisible soldiers in a war their country would never publicly admit to fighting, used, not honored, by the same command that sent them. Israeli intelligence noticed the pattern almost immediately. Flight discipline changed. Radio chatter changed. Analysts monitoring Egyptian air activity began flagging formations that flew tighter, more rigid patterns than anything Egyptian pilots had shown before. Habits drilled into pilots at training bases outside Moscow, not Cairo. The proof came from signals intelligence. Listening posts intercepted radio transmissions between pilots in the air, and the voices weren't speaking Arabic. They were speaking Russian, using Soviet military phrasing that Israeli analysts recognized instantly from years of monitoring Warsaw Pact exercises in Europe. Israel now faced an impossible decision. Engaging Soviet pilots risked direct confrontation with a nuclear superpower. Ignoring them meant losing air superiority over the Suez Front entirely. For months, Israeli commanders were ordered to avoid engaging Soviet-flown aircraft, not out of fear, but out of calculated restraint. Nobody in Jerusalem wanted to be the one who started a war with Moscow. Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor, was briefed on the Soviet deployment almost as soon as U.S. intelligence confirmed it. And here is where Washington's own hands got dirty. The United States didn't rush to warn Israel of the full scale of what was happening. Intelligence on the Soviet buildup was shared selectively, on Washington's timeline, not Israel's, held back in part because Kissinger saw the crisis as leverage in his own larger negotiation with Moscow, not simply as a threat to an ally's safety. An ally's pilots were, in effect, a bargaining chip in a much bigger game being played in Washington and Moscow, one Israel wasn't fully informed it was part of. Inside the Nixon administration, officials at the Pentagon and State Department pushed for a hard public line, naming the Soviet pilots directly, forcing Moscow into an embarrassing denial on the world stage. Kissinger overruled them, choosing deliberate ambiguity instead. Quietly reassure Israel that the U.S. would help offset the threat, while avoiding any public statement that could box either superpower into a corner. Behind closed doors, the U.S. began accelerating advanced Phantom fighter deliveries to Israel, a response calculated to shift the military balance without ever naming the reason out loud. By July 1970, Israeli commanders had grown tired of restraint. Soviet-flown MiGs were becoming bolder, pushing deeper toward the canal, and Israeli intelligence believed the moment had come to send a message, carefully, without triggering the war nobody wanted. On July 30th, the Israeli Air Force set a trap. A small formation of Israeli aircraft flew a deliberately provocative route near the canal. Bait, sent in knowing it might draw Soviet-flown MiGs into a fight the pilots inside those decoy jets couldn't necessarily win alone. Hidden above and behind them, a much larger force of Israeli Phantoms and Mirages waited in ambush. The choice of target wasn't incidental. Egyptian formations were flying the same skies that day. Israeli commanders specifically waited for Soviet-flown aircraft to take the bait, a calculated decision to strike Moscow's pilots rather than Cairo's, sending a political message to the Kremlin rather than simply degrading Egyptian air power. The Soviet pilots took the bait. As their MiGs climbed to intercept what looked like an easy target, the ambush force dropped down behind them. In the confused, high-speed engagement that followed, Israeli pilots shot down 4 Soviet-flown aircraft in a matter of minutes. Soviet pilots died in a war their own government had never officially admitted to joining. Men who, weeks earlier, had told their families they were on a training assignment. For a few tense hours afterward, nobody knew how far this would go. What if one of the pilots killed that day had been a senior Soviet officer, not a rank-and-file flyer? What if Moscow had chosen to respond publicly, demanding acknowledgement, forcing Washington to pick a side in the open? Historians who've studied the period point out how easily July 30th could have escalated into exactly the kind of superpower confrontation both Washington and Moscow had spent months trying to avoid. It didn't happen that way, but the margin between the crisis that occurred and a far more dangerous one was thinner than either government was comfortable admitting. Moscow's actual response was silence. No protest, no acknowledgement, no retaliation. Because admitting the loss meant admitting Soviet pilots had been there in the first place. And that was a truth the Kremlin was not willing to put on the record, even in defeat. For the families of the pilots who died that day, the truth came in fragments, if it came at all. Some were told only that their sons had died while carrying out a special assignment abroad. No country was named. No cause was given. The same government that sent them in secret let them die in secret too, denied even in death, because acknowledging their sacrifice meant admitting the lie. The July 30th engagement didn't end the crisis, it diffused it. Within weeks, a ceasefire took hold along the Suez front, and Soviet combat flights over Egypt quietly wound down. But the episode left a lasting mark on the man who had played Israel's intelligence like a card in his own hand. 3 years later, in October 1973, Kissinger would face an even more dangerous standoff with Moscow during the Yom Kippur War, when U.S. forces went to DEFCON 3 amid fears of direct Soviet military intervention. Historians who've studied his private notes and memoirs point to 1970 as the moment Kissinger learned exactly how far superpower brinkmanship could go before it broke into open war, and exactly how much could be managed through silence, back channels, and other people's lives rather than public confrontation. For decades, the full scale of Operation Kavkaz stayed buried in classified files on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It wasn't until archives began opening in the years after the Soviet collapse, more than 20 years later, that historians could confirm what intelligence agencies had known all along. Soviet pilots had flown as many as several hundred combat sorties against Israel, and the July 30th engagement had come within a hair's breadth of forcing a direct American-Soviet military confrontation. Some of the pilots who survived the deployment gave interviews decades later, describing a mission their own country never once publicly acknowledged while it was happening. The men who died were never named by their own government. For one tense summer in 1970, 3 governments played a dangerous game with soldiers who weren't given a say, and every one of them, for their own reasons, chose silence over truth.